mites. Talk to us about mites and solutions to eliminate them. Really just kind of giving you the microphone here and drop some knowledge bombs on us.
For sure. So I think the big one that most people are dealing with, like with not just medicinal plants, but in general, are like two-spotted spider mite. I talked about it extensively. They feed on like 4,000 plus plants. Spider mites are really good at adapting to different plants, and they can even have populations become very specific on different species in as much as a few generations, where they adapt their genes very quickly to the host plant. So spider mites are very common, but there's also a lot of solutions for them. I like to use things like wettable sulfur, for example. That can be very helpful, unless it's harsh for a particular plant that you're applying to. So always be careful. Always apply a little bit to see if the plant has a phytotoxic response or something like this. That's always helpful for other products that are new that you haven't applied before. You can also use biocontrols. I'm a huge fan of using things like Persimilis mites or Californicus mites or things like that. I also like to use them preventatively. I think that's their most efficient use case, although it does require the best practices and the use cases, knowing your quality control, knowing your sourcing. Are you getting them from a tertiary distributor or a primary producer? How many are you applying? Are you applying too many for your location? And maybe you're in a smaller area, and maybe even the smallest increment of the biocontrol you can get is kind of overkill already, so you'll have to make those choices yourself. This will be true for most biocontrols. Russet mites are also a big deal, obviously in medicinal plants, but also in a lot of other plants too. I dealt with rose russet mite in like 8 years ago with Gerbera daisies and roses and things, and that cost a lot of money, and it also cost the supplier like $1 million to like retrofit everything because it transfers a virus. So the russet mites that other people are dealing with in other plants, this is not necessarily the case, but in the rose russet mite that was the case. And anyways, the way that you deal with them is you got to be very preventive. Usually they're very small. Their damage is very overt though. So if you see gnarling and curling, then you know you're looking at something that might be a russet mite. Other damage can look like russet mites, but if you see this like sort of crinkling damage, that's typically a telltale sign. Broad mites are like that too. But if you are dealing with russet mites, one thing to note that I think a lot of people don't realize is that russet mites are very specialized. So most of the time you're only dealing with specific species. So for example, if you're growing coconuts or you're growing a medicinal plant and you've got tomatoes and you know there's a tomato russet mite, the tomato russet mite probably won't be able to feed on your other plants, if that makes sense. So that's something that I see people getting confused about online a lot. And I have a video on my YouTube channel that basically talks about all kinds of russet mites, where they come from evolutionarily, how did they adapt the way they did, and what you can do to defeat them. Same with spider mites and a lot of these other pests as well.
I have been fortunate enough not to come across spider mites or russet mites, so fingers crossed that never happens. I'm going to knock on wood right here and hope that it never happens there, because I heard that both of those are very tough to combat. Particularly the russet mites are said to be more tough to combat than the spider mites, but spider mites can be very difficult to combat from what I hear, particularly when you're in flowering, because it's harder to kind of, you don't have the sprays to really fall back on. And once they get out of control and start webbing, it's just game over from there.
Yeah, they're really difficult. I feel like they represent two ends of a spectrum of what kind of pests you can deal with. On the one hand, you've got spider mites, super common, in my opinion, less difficult to deal with, although if you let them get out of control, they all become very hard to deal with. On the other hand, you've got russet mites, which I feel like are a little bit less common for people. Maybe it depends on where you're at. But they're much more extreme in their damage when you get them. And the damage they cause is typically like permanent afterwards. You get stunting, you get these other problems. So you have different maybe threat levels for different pests.
This clip is brought to you by AC Infinity. Use discount code MrGrow at 15 to save on any of their products.